welcome. We've got a great group here today, what I would call happy warriors in the fight for sound budgeting, good tax policy, and really deregulation and that sort of thing as well. So we've got a great group here today. Thank you again for joining us. Let me get straight to our guests though, because we've got a lot to discuss during this roughly hour that will be here today. The first person that will go is my good friend Matt Dickerson. He is the director for the Grover M. Hermann Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation. Has done a lot of great work over the years, looking at the budget, diving in, and finding some good insights. And so he's going to talk to us some about the federal budget and how that could apply to states as well. So it'll be a good discussion there. So welcome. Thank you, Matt. The next person is Jonathan Williams, another one of my good friends. He is the Executive Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist at the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC. He's another one of those good happy warriors who brings some good insights along the way. They have a lot of good model legislation up on their website that you also want to check out when you get a chance. The next speaker we'll have today is Ganon Evans. Ganon Evans is another person that I met here just in the last few months. It's probably a little bit longer than that now, but he is also another great happy warrior who does a lot of good research and dives into budgets. And he is the director of fiscal policy policy manager and analyst in the Kansas Policy Institute's Sandlian Center for Entrepreneurial Government. That's a mouthful, Ganon, but you do some great work there. And so he's going to talk some about the responsible Kansas budget. And last but certainly not least, we have James Hohman, who is the director of fiscal policy at the Mackinac Center. He's another great happy warrior who has a good podcast that he may mention here in a little while, and does some great work. The Overton Window is the name of that podcast, so you want to check that out. And they recently released at the Mackinac Center the Sustainable Michigan Budget, and so we'll want to talk about some of those key efforts. As you all know, we've here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we put out the Conservative Texas Budget. We've been doing that since 2015, so we have 4 of those budgets out. And what we've seen is that has helped to define the narrative that we really have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. And you really focus in on that. And we've seen that not only help with the public start to take note of what the legislature is doing with the budget, but then really start to influence the budget process to where the 6 budgets before that period, before 2015, the growth rate was 12% on a biennial basis for a 2-year budget cycle, whereas population growth plus inflation, which is the measure that we use for this budgeting approach, was 7%. So there's a 5 percentage point difference there. Well, the 4 budgets since the Conservative Texas budget, the appropriation to appropriations, this is the entire budget, has decreased now to 5.2%. So less than half of what it was during the prior 6 budgets. And the population plus inflation, 6.2%. So the budget on a biennial basis is now a full percentage point below population growth plus inflation and half what it was the prior time. So I'm not going to say that it was all because of the Conservative Texas budget. I would not say that. There's been a lot of good changes within the legislature and leadership and things of that nature, but it is a way to start to really focus on the major problem of too much government spending. And I think we want to start with too much government spending with you, Matt, and thinking about the federal budget and what's all been going on there, and some of the things that you're watching. I know that y'all are going to be working on kind of a blueprint where y'all kind of put a roadmap out that talks about here are some areas that maybe we don't need to be spending as much money on with our taxpayer dollars. And so, Matt, I'd love to turn it over for you for a few minutes, just kind of give an overview of anything that you'd like to discuss on the federal budget. So thanks, Matt.
Great. Thanks so much, Vance. And thanks to everybody for tuning in here. Like Vance said, I'm going to talk about some of what's going on in D.C. in terms of fiscal policy. Spoiler alert, it's too much spending. And then I'm going to end by touching on this project that Vance alluded to that we've been working on here at the Heritage Foundation that will really help policymakers go on offense with a positive, proactive agenda regarding fiscal policy and what we need to do to get our country back on the right track. So as everybody knows, for the last year, we've all been fighting Biden's big government socialist spending bill, the Build Back Better Act. And thankfully, we have been successful so far. And all the credit goes to the great work the folks here and throughout the country have done pushing back against the BBB. So thank you all so much for the great work you've done. But even though Senator Manchin has held strong so far, Democrats, the media, and even some Republicans want to revive some aspects of the BBB agenda. So we need to keep being vigilant. I also want to note for folks that might not be aware, Senator Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico recently suffered a stroke. So first and foremost, we all want to pray for his health and a full and speedy recovery. But it also does mean that at least for the next several weeks, there are only 49 Democrat senators in town who are able to vote for something on the Senate floor. So that means even if Schumer can get Manchin to agree to something, Republicans can still block anything from moving through the legislative process. Of course, that doesn't mean that everything that goes through Congress is going to be a good thing. Right now, some of the big spenders in Congress have started negotiating what's called an omnibus appropriations bill. As folks know, the 1/3 of the federal government that relies on annual appropriations has been operating under a continuing resolution since October. That just extended Trump's last spending bill. But Biden and the progressives desperately want to massively increase non-defense discretionary spending. And they also want to insert all sorts of extreme policy provisions into the federal spending stream, like government funding for abortions and things like that. At the same time, there are some Republicans who are willing to trade just about anything to achieve higher levels of defense spending. So one of the big policy risks that folks need to be paying attention to is that we could be seeing a multi-thousand plus page spending bill moving through Congress in the next couple of weeks. And a really big risk of an omnibus appropriations bill moving through Congress is that it's likely to become a must-pass proverbial Christmas tree that gets loaded up with all sorts of other bad policy items. In particular, Democrats and some Republicans want to add even more COVID bailout spending and massively increase spending. Every constituency in town, basically from the restaurants to music venues to even minor league baseball, have been lobbying for more bailout taxpayer spending. And so the folks here all know that more federal stimulus spending is only going to subsidize bad COVID policies at the state and local level, things like lockdowns or mask mandates or vaccine passports, as well as this is only going to drive inflation up even higher. So that's a big risk that we should be talking about and paying attention to. So even though we've had some really important policy wins that we should celebrate over the last couple of weeks, we should know and be vigilant that there are some really important policy risks to the taxpayers and the economy on the horizon that could be moving in the next couple of weeks. So what should we be doing about it? The federal budget's a mess. We just hit the $30 trillion mark. The trust funds are insolvent. And so we know that it's an even number year and folks need positive things to be talking about. So me and my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation have been working over the last several months on a comprehensive budget blueprint that would roll back excessive government spending. It would prioritize taxpayer dollars. It would reform our major entitlement programs, restore federalism, promote opportunity for all, and protect individual rights and our American values. We've got included more than 200 different specific policy proposals that we'll be rolling out. It's got everything from tackling the big entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, to other things like winding down the Federal Department of Education, to advancing pro-growth tax reform. Overall, we would show how we could cut spending by about $12 trillion and reduce taxes by about $2 trillion over the next 10 years. And this would ensure that the federal budget is sustainable, meeting the conditions of a responsible American budget. And we would reduce the size, scope, and reach of the federal government to its proper roles. And we think that this would be a good, positive, proactive policy agenda for lawmakers to be talking about. And so we will be releasing this on February 22nd. I'll make sure to be sending that around to Vance and others that are interested and excited to talk about this and have a good rest of our conversation here. So Vance, I'll yield back to you there.
Although, thanks, Matt. That's excellent. And I was just thinking, I mean, there's so many good insights that are in the document, and I look forward to. You said February 22nd is when it'll be released.
That's right. That's when we're doing our big public rollout. So
okay, great. James, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, not to commandeer everything, but can we, Matt? Can we talk for just a second about how crazy these federal transfers to the states are? I mean, a big chunk of money was given to our state lawmakers under the assumption that they lost revenue and that they have immediate needs to spend some more money. And here in Michigan, like none of those were true. In Michigan, we didn't lose revenue. Most states didn't. And if there was a big immediate need for extra spending, it hasn't shown up. And usually, like, if there's a need, it's easy to get bipartisan support for it. Instead, we're just about a year since those funds have been authorized, and they're just still sitting on the sidelines because, our lawmakers have difficulty trying to figure out exactly what to do with all this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you hit the nail right on the head. And it creates this federal spending, this federal borrowing, so we could do more transfers to the state governments, just creates all sorts of bad incentives for all sorts of bad policy items, not only with the federal stimulus funds, but the recent trillion-plus federal infrastructure package that they recently passed that's just going to flood the states with even more money and create all sorts of bad incentives to spend taxpayer money that we just don't have.
Yeah, it has been massive, and we've seen it all across the states. I mean, Texas received $30 billion from ARPA, state and local. And then even the latest, the infrastructure bill, the Jobs Act, it could be billions, will be billions more that are coming this way. And now, I mean, hopefully Build Back Better or Build Back Bankrupt, what we like to call it, is dead, but maybe it's going to have another life. And then you have the Competes Act, looks to be $300 billion plus more dollars, and that one has a lot of regulatory costs that are going to be far excess of that $300 plus billion dollars. That could be really costly for the economy at a time when, as y'all mentioned, we're already spending way too much. And I know you mentioned it briefly there, Matt, but the Responsible American Budget, which is basically the same sort of approach of the entire budget, fiscal rule of spending limit, population growth plus inflation. If we had just followed population growth and inflation over the last 2 decades, instead of adding about $20 trillion in the national debt, we would have had a surplus of $3 trillion. It's a $23 trillion swing. So that's not even saying cutting spending, which I think all of us probably would want that, but that's just slowing the growth rate. You can really start to bring things back in line. So I'm looking forward to the blueprint when it comes out and us being able to highlight a lot of these key areas that the federal budget really needs to start focusing on. And I'm hoping some of those in Congress will listen. That's good. All right. So I'd like to now over to Jonathan Williams over at ALEC. And I know that he's been looking a lot what the states have been doing. And I'd love to get some of your thoughts about what you're seeing, Jonathan, and maybe even some thoughts on the federal budget and what's influencing a lot of the state activity.
Well, thanks, Vance. And Matt made my point of my opening always of greetings from the land of make-believe even funnier, because just talking about everything that's gone on here and the overall posture of overtaxing and overspending just continuing to an insane degree now. And to James' point, from the very start of this whole discussion around a federal bailout of the states, we were jumping up and down. And Vance remembers this well at OMB. I mean, we were telling everybody, even calendar year 2020, state and local government was ahead of where it was in calendar 2019. Imagine that. And this whole thing was predicated on state and local governments were in the poorhouse and they needed our taxpayer cash to come and bail them out. It was all a farce from the start. We called it. And of course, it's just continued. But I mean, it gets back to the Rahm Emanuel, or even much further back than that, never let a good crisis go to waste, a philosophy of governing. And that's unfortunately the approach that we've seen. Thank goodness for Joe Manchin and Kristen.
I mean, they're okay letting it go to waste.
Unlikely sources taking pretty principled stances around some of these tax and spending debates. It surprised many veteran DC watchers. And of course, I guess the threat is always there that things could come back in some less expensive format. So I think all of us need to be vigilant in watching, of course, the movements on Capitol Hill, as Matt alluded to. But as it relates to the states, what we've seen, and I'm going on my 15th year here very soon at ALEC, I've seen a few of these battles play out. And I remember very well the bailouts of the states in the Obama era and the kind of public finance and really political economy problems that caused at the state level and at the local level. And, we're seeing a lot of the same things start to play out all over again. And it's something that concerns us greatly. It's something that as you talk to state appropriators and state budget legislators that sit on those committees, they say, Jonathan, we have so much cash right now. We don't know how we're going to spend it all. Now, that's a dangerous thought for those of us who value the taxpayer's perspective and value the principled limited government perspective on things. These are some of the most dangerous times that we, I think, live in when it comes to our debates around the right levels of taxing and spending and protecting taxpayers. And I think there's a few things that we've tried to do from an ALEC perspective to educate legislators on best practices. We have, for instance, a statement of principles up that was adopted by our Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force, and Vance serves on that and was involved in this debate. But something that we look at in terms of ARPA and aid to state and local governments. Obviously, one of the biggest best practices you can have there is temporary funds require temporary spending. This is something that so many state and local governments violated last time around, and it came back to bite them in a major way. Obviously, there's some creative ways that states can spend federal funds that are less bad. We've talked about this several times on various other webinars, whether it's UI, replenishing state unemployment insurance trust funds to avoiding tax increases on the business community and job creators, whether it's looking to conform to elements of the federal tax code, for instance, giving flexible NOL treatment for net operating losses through federal conformity. But things that state lawmakers should think through right now is priority-based budgeting, back to 101 of best practices. Alec has been talking about this for well over a decade and a half now. In fact, my partner in crime on this, many of you know him well, the great Bob Williams, who's now retired but just turned 80 years old this week. So happy birthday, Bob! He led this fight for us with our budget reform toolkit that he and I put together, and some other practices of Bearstown, Washington State in priority-based budgeting. We need to get back to that as a principle, and then of course. The last thing that we talk about in our statement is state and local oversight. So obviously, many of these funds will be well accounted for by state officials going through the regular process of budgeting. But in many cases, many of those federal dollars, as we know, went directly to local units of government and are fall outside, unfortunately, the watchful eyes of many taxpayer friends and state legislative bodies. And so that is something I think that we really need to turn our attention to look to make sure those are transparent. There's some sort of return on investment for taxpayers on the spending, and even to know what it's being spent on. I think getting back to that basic transparency point is key. And let me just say a couple of other brief points in that. What has this all meant in terms of the gusher of cash at the state level? One, I think it's doubled down the importance on creating things like responsible budgets with real fiscal rules, whether that's in the style of Colorado and the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or Michigan's Headley Amendment, or others that are meaningful when it comes to putting real institutional rules in place to protect taxpayers from overspending. That's something that we at ALEC will continue to pursue. We have some additional resources getting ready to be released very soon on that. And then, of course, this has turned the direction because of the resources at the state level, and rightly so. Many of the fiscally conservative legislators we work with are saying, if we don't give it back to taxpayers in the form of real tax reductions and marginal rate reductions and reducing tax burdens meaningfully, we know these dollars will be spent. And of course, there was the effort in Congress by Senator Manchin, allegedly, and Senator Schumer to say states cannot cut taxes if they accept the federal money. Thankfully, the federal courts have ruled in the favor of federalism and 10th Amendment principles so far here. I think that's been clarified in many cases in federal circuit courts. But states are cutting taxes dramatically across the board, whether it's personal income, business income, and trying to make themselves more competitive. And that is exactly the right approach. And taking our 50 laboratories of democracy concept, we are seeing states like Mississippi, who's already voted this session overwhelmingly to phase out their personal income tax over the next 10 years out of the Mississippi House. Whether it's North Carolina, who just voted in their last budget to repeal their corporate income tax over the next 10 years by 2030. So we're seeing some transformative policies being enacted on tax cuts. And a lot of that is related to the dollar sitting there. So the states that are getting it right are investing it back to become more competitive. And I'm afraid the states that are getting it wrong are setting themselves up for a massive failure in the future when federal funds run out and when the economy turns. So Vance, I'll stop there, but that's a brief snapshot of what we're seeing at the state capitol level.
Hey, Jonathan, I wanted to follow up on a point that you made, because I think it's really underappreciated with these tax elimination policies. Like when we started back in the 2000s, Jonathan, no state had ever eliminated any of its major taxes. You can only add them, you never get rid of them. And now that's just not the case. We've got some people that are saying, look, we can afford to live without these taxes. That's something that has never happened before, and I'm really happy to see it continue.
Absolutely. And it's competitive pressure, right? Immediately now in the Southeast, the discussion is, if Mississippi gets us across the finish line, what do we in Arkansas and what do we in Louisiana and what do we in Alabama and Georgia need to do to stay up? We know that we've been behind Tennessee and we've been behind Florida, but now if Mississippi goes in that direction, it's a domino scenario where states in that region absolutely know that they have to change to keep up. And you're right. I mean, getting rid of a major tax is a massive undertaking. In fact, kind of paraphrasing our great friend and mentor Milton Friedman, this is the closest thing to eternal life in earth is a big major tax like this at the state or federal level. And so ripping it out from its roots and becoming a no income tax state, for instance, is one of the very best things that states can do.
Well, that's certainly right. And thank you both for that. And James or others, please chime in if you'll have questions too. I love it. One of the things that you touched on, Jonathan, was just the importance of the competition that's out there and the importance of state policy. Federalism is so important there. My colleague EJ Antoni, I know he's listening in. He's on here with us. He just had a good report out on our website at texaspolicy.com called "Paid Not to Work: How Supplemental Unemployment Insurance Benefits Decreased Employment from 2020 to 2021," where he actually went through and looked at the different states that stopped it early on, which are mostly red states. Like in Texas, we ended that accepting that unemployment bonus, so the plus up to $300 a week from the federal government on June 26th. And what you saw was that there was faster job creation, more people getting back to work instead of being dependent on government as that went away. And imagine this, that incentives matter. Right, and that's what we found here as well. And so we need more of that push towards tax cuts, tax relief, and if you're going to be running massive surpluses, like in Texas, the comptroller recently said we're probably going to have at least $12 billion in a surplus, and that's not including our rainy day fund of $12 billion. We've got about $25 billion that we're going to be sitting on, and we need to find ways to get that back into the private sector. So I'm excited what's happening across the rest of the nation, because I'm hopeful that we can then point to that and say, Texas, y'all need to be doing it too. We need more tax relief here as well. So that's really good insight there. I want to go over to Ganon next. And Ganon, I know you've been working on the responsible Kansas budget and there it is. And been working on some of these other things. And I've just wondered, what you have thought about the process and what you've been hearing from legislators and others as you've released this here recently.
Absolutely. Yeah. First off, it's a pleasure to be on today. Thank you for the invite. And I thought I'd give just a lot of perspective across Kansas as a whole right now, and then lead that into why the responsible budget is so important. But yeah, as we mentioned, states across the nation are flushed with cash. Just this past January, the intake of revenue was 14.5% greater than the estimates, with those estimates being boosted from estimates made in July. Like the estimates were redone back in like October, November-ish. This January's tax revenue intake was 18.7% higher than the tax intake in January of last year, in the middle of COVID and at the start of the recovery, right when it started to look like lockdowns were getting more pushback. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but the biggest one is simply that tax revenues didn't decrease as much or at all as how governments thought they would as a result of COVID-19. And as we mentioned before, put in the billions of dollars in federal aid. We have the second round of ARPA coming to certain states in April and May. There's still billions of dollars sitting around. And I know that we've talked to local governments and some of these small towns in Kansas that relatively aren't receiving that much money. I mean, like still hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're simply like, we don't really know what to do with this. That's in the purview of what federal ARPA says we could do with this, because the goal of this federal funding is that you can't establish permanent long-term programs with it. You can support things that had to get cuts because of changes in COVID, but you can't like go out and hire a bunch of new people. You can't go out and do these things. You could do one-time projects, but Kansas is really trying to figure this out both at the state and the local level. And right now in the legislature, discussion in the legislature is dominated by ideas of what to do with this cash pile of both tax revenue and of ARPA. And across many states, you see these tax programs, like, as we mentioned, like income taxes, corporate income taxes. The discussion in Kansas is focusing on the food sales tax. We have one of the highest food sales taxes at 9.8%. And eliminating that is like eliminating $450 million. If it was just $440, that would be nice. $450 million from the budget every year. There is a tax rebate, so just a flat $250 to every taxpayer who I think filed in 2020. That's a one-time thing of $460 million. But the very spicy thing that happened this week and the very controversial thing is the governor just okayed a plan to give a multi-billion-dollar subsidy to this mystery company to develop a campus somewhere in Kansas. We don't know who the company is. We don't know where it's going to be located. And there's just this huge push for subsidies. Kansas is very much driven by a lot of subsidies, at least from the government level. There's billions of dollars in what are called star bonds and peak bonds in the state. I know those exist in some form in other states, but we've done reports, independent organizations, other independent organizations have done reports. The billions of taxpayer dollars that are going into these don't show any economic difference than what would have happened naturally. And so the predicament we're in is that everyone's discussing, let's talk about moving the budget. Let's talk about what it's going to look like in the long term. And now everybody's playing with, boom, there goes $1 billion from the general fund, from the budget, right? And so, as I mentioned, we have roughly like a $3 billion cash pile. Before this subsidy bill got approved, over this next year, that cash pile would already be decreasing by $1.6 billion, not to count the long-term effects of getting rid of programs or instituting much long-term changes. And so it's especially important in Kansas because back in 2012, there was huge, very big revenue surplus. The government pursued large tax cuts, but you increase spending. That leads to a deficit. And so the big message that we're trying to get out right now is, hey, tax relief is great because we're overtaxing people. We have this huge cash pile. It is time for tax relief. But at the same time, if you don't approach spending from the same angle, you're going to end up with a deficit. Or if you give out billions of dollars in corporate welfare while you're discussing tax cuts, you're not going to be able to return that money to ordinary people, ordinary businesses that are already here in the state in paying their taxes. And it's crazy. And so how the RKB plays into this, I know the nice printed copy, it is a framework for how we can approach legislators. This is the start of saying, hey, if we just go by population and inflation, this is what our all funds budget looks like. The Responsible Kansas budget pins the 2023 budget at $21 billion, which is a 2.32% increase above 2022 appropriations. That's due to the growth of population and inflation. This is what a theoretically natural growth of the budget would look like. And then the governor's budget that was released last month is closer to $23 billion. And so it's something that we could go to legislators for and say, look, here's a natural rate of growth. Here is all this additional spending and additional programs. And it gets the gears rolling, right? At least how I've been using it, the RKB isn't the final, okay, we got to push this through the legislature. It is a tool to get people talking. And as Vance mentioned with Texas, after 1 year, you're not going to see the legislature just picking it up and running with it. But if you could start having conversations with people and getting it through of, hey, we need to be a lot more sensitive to how we spend our money, you're going to see long-term change. The other big part of it that, at least my position, what we've done is dig through at a lot of the underlying explanations for why, it's good that we do subsidies. It's good that we want to do more spending. Point at the revenue. Say this is overtaxation. One of the big arguments for subsidies is we need more jobs. The subsidies have worked. Kansas is in a booming economy because of subsidies. And when you look at the labor reports, and we're still 24,000 jobs under January 2020 levels, while states have caught up and exceeded to their January 2020 levels, you break those expectations. I know I feel like I've ranted a little bit, but to bring it all in with RKB, it is a tool that we could use to discuss what the budget should look like, and over time make connections with legislators so that even if it's not a decision related to the budget as a whole, if it's a decision of do I vote yes or no on this big subsidy plan, they'll think back to this and they'll say, if you give a mouse a cookie, if you give a subsidy to one company, you're going to give billions away over the next decade. And if I vote no now, I'm going to be closer to being on a responsible budget than would I have if I voted yes.
Yes.
I could also briefly touch on ARPA real quick. This is something I'm transitioning to work on more. But the biggest issue I've had with ARPA, working with it, is just tracking how much money everyone is getting and where is it going, especially to local levels, because there's no standardized way that a city announces this is what we're doing with ARPA. And even right now, a lot of cities, as I mentioned, are up in the air of, well, we have all this money, what do we need to do? And so transparency is a really big deal. I mean, just as a whole, transparency is how you get to a more responsible government. And finding ways to improve transparency around ARPA is a huge step in how you can prevent mismanagement of that money.
Yeah, no, that's great, Ganon. I think, James, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, I wanted to follow up with one of these policies that I've been working with a great cross-ideological group of people who are trying to push back on these corporate handouts. And I mean, the political incentives around them are so tough because these are huge companies. They approach lawmakers and say, look, give us a bunch of money and we'll create jobs. You'll show up at the ribbon cutting ceremonies, groundbreaking ceremonies. You'll get credit for this one, and no one's going to complain about it. And if you don't, we're going to publicly humiliate you by saying that we're going to go in the next state that is going to get this. Now, I think most of those threats are hollow. But what I would rather see is for states to say, look, we just don't want to play this game anymore. Reaching out with each other, we've worked to introduce an interstate compact in a number of states already, where we agree to stop these selective subsidy programs together. And so I'd love to see more interest paid to that.
Yeah, James reminded me of a point that we've been trying to make as 2022 is an election year, and especially seeing how things have played out at the national level, even for states that have been a bit separated from national politics. National politics will reflect on those elections. It's important to talk to legislators and say, look, people are going to propose things as safe election year policies, right? Like if you give a rebate to somebody right before an election, you could go back and say, I gave you tax relief.
But no, those are great points. And just to kind of reiterate, I mean, you just want to provide as much transparency as possible. I don't know what all the other states have done yet, but in Texas, they actually separated all of the ARPA funds into a separate article, Article 12 of the budget, which is a good idea because now that keeps the pots separated. But that was something we did here in Texas, was to separate out those funds in Article 12, and then we're going to have a website that's going to highlight where all the dollars are flowing. So transparency is really key with all these dollars. All right, James, last but certainly not least, and maybe we'll have some more time for some discussion after this too, is what's been going on in Michigan and there at Mackinac Center on things that you've been working on with the budget.
Yeah. I mean, state's fiscal situation is like everyone else. We've got a ton of cash, and our lawmakers are struggling to figure out how to spend it. And of course, Michigan is, we've got a Republican legislature with slim majorities, but majorities, and a Democratic governor, and they haven't been able to agree on much. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that Republicans and Democrats don't always agree, but on budget matters, it's usually much easier to find bipartisanship. I mean, legislators need to bring money home to their district. Governors need to tout their latest initiatives, and spending interests are there to make sure that you spend every single dollar of revenue. So that consensus, that bipartisan consensus on budget matters, has just not been happening right now. Now, we were looking at the situation with all this cash that's sitting around, and Vance has been trying to convince other places to do these conservative, responsible budgets. And so I talked with him about it. We looked at the numbers, we talked it out, we hashed out exactly like, if we want restraint, what do we do with this? What do we hold? What do we include in this limit? What do we not? And how can we be successful? Because if you're just telling lawmakers to spend less than the revenues, that's usually a tough sell. I mean, there's a lot of, for every person that tells you to spend less, there's 10,000 other people that are going to say spend more. And so Vance is like, look, we talked about his experience. It was really interesting. By the way, check out that podcast. It's the Overton Window podcast. It's a great episode. Vance is a great guest. And the theme of the podcast is to talk to people who are changing what is politically possible, because there's a lot of great reforms that have been happening around, and I'm happy to talk to people about their victories. But in Vance, it's like, look, if you have a good relationship, if you make this recommendation, they can see some benefits because they can use the savings to do important fiscal policy goals that they otherwise might not get credit for. So lowering taxes, paying down debt, putting yourself in a better financial position in the future. And so we talked about it and we said, all right, with this situation where Michigan's got a ton of revenue coming up, do we think if we make this recommendation, our lawmakers are going to listen? And that was a tough decision. A lot of that just meant like, we need to put this together. We need to put our strongest message forward, and then talk to lawmakers before we release it, to hear their concerns, to address their concerns. So this is one of the reasons why we call our project the Sustainable Michigan Budget rather than the Responsible Michigan Budget, because one lawmaker is like, look, I feel like if the governor beats us on this issue, you're going to call me irresponsible. And I don't like that. If you call it unsustainable, I'll agree, that kind of thing. So we did this project. We met with the leadership. We put out our release. Vance was great help with all of this. And we did this a week before the governor announced her own budget. And throughout the whole week, she's been leaking to the press her major initiatives. And so they asked the Senate Majority Leader, for instance, what he thinks about the governor's proposals, and he's like, "Look, I want to be more responsible. I think we need to limit this next budget to population and inflation." I'm like, "Yes, we do." And in fact, further legislative leadership has also reiterated the points of restraint, of sustainability, and responsibility. So this is really good to see, because the governor did release her budget, and it's way over the Sustainable Michigan budget amount. And so it's nice to see that the immediate reaction to this one is saying, let's take a step back and let's look at this. Because I think if this thing goes right, the governor, I mean, again, even though bipartisan agreement on fiscal policy has been challenging to get, the governor's indicated she's interested in some tax relief. She wants it in the form of pension exemptions and tax credits for low-income households, but that at least is her saying, we don't need to spend everything on current services. We can set aside some things for tax relief. And that, I think, opens up the conversation over how much and how. So I'm very excited to see what happens. We're going to keep weighing in on this issue. I was a little frustrated because I wrote an opposite editorial for the Detroit News to run calling for a sustainable Michigan budget. And the governor had one in today promoting her budget. I'm like, please let me be the opposite to her on this. And unfortunately, it's going to run later afterwards. So,
well, that's too bad. Keep trying, Jonathan.
Vance, and thanks, James, for the comments there. As a Michigan native myself, I always follow it very closely and appreciate the great work that you guys are doing. You kind of alluded to something that we're seeing nationally. I wanted to kind of survey this brain trust here to get everyone's thoughts on, and that is almost every governor who has given the State of the State or equivalent address so far has called for tax relief in some way, which is great. I mean, Democrats, Republicans across the board. One approach, I think we're seeing tax cuts across the board and rate reduction proposals from many of the governors. Tate Reeves of Mississippi endorsing the income tax elimination, for instance, and others of Speaker Guns in the House. But that being said, a lot of the maybe left of center governors, while they're saying tax cuts, many times it's special favorites to one industry over another. Now, I know you've had this battle in Michigan with some of the issues of cronyism and kind of the directed government resources to one industry over another or one company over another. But I wanted to ask something specifically is some of the things that we're seeing is kind of a renewed call from governors to expand or create state level earned income tax credit programs like Whitmer did there in Michigan. So what's the take of this group on that approach? Good, bad, ugly?
Plenty. It opens the room for negotiation in ways that has not happened in the previous 3 years. Like any tax cut discussion recently would have just been, no, even if you get the votes, we're going to veto it. So I think that has changed things. And I think as far as discussions about how to cut taxes, like, look, I'm okay with bipartisanship. The earned income tax credit is not the worst thing in the world. It's not the most distortionary. It's not the most. It's broad. It favors a broad number of households. It's means tested. So there's some things that are about it that make it tolerable. It's not my first inclination, especially when there's already the federal earned income tax credit available. But if we pass a tax cut that includes earned income tax credits, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. I would happily take that trade-off or that compromise.
What about others? Because we're hearing this from a lot of state legislators and governors of what are the merits or demerits of taking that approach on EITC, if that's something that can find bipartisan support, as James was saying.
Yeah, Matt, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'll weigh in from the federal perspective there. I know my colleague, Robert Rector, has done a lot of work on the EITC over the years, and there's lots of problems with the program at least at the federal level. It's one of the highest of all the programs that have problems with program integrity of payments that the federal government makes that they shouldn't have made. About a quarter of EITC payments are calculated as improper by the GAO. So there's a lot of problems, at least at the federal level, that I hope if states are advancing that type of program, that they're learning some of the lessons of what not to do from the federal government.
That makes sense. Ganon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Coming from somebody who's fresh out of college and somebody who, and I mean, I'm 21, all of my friends are in college still, but when you say tax cuts and you hear and say tax cuts, people my age immediately think tax cuts for the rich. And particularly, like, it's hard to get just a lot of support for just saying we need to cut taxes, even if it's the most efficient thing to do. And in particular, in Kansas, the situation is the state wants to cut taxes, but we are afraid of saying tax cuts because of the history of tax cuts. And like the food sales tax elimination is in effect a tax cut. But one of the big things that the Governor Laura Kelly, who's a Democrat, is running on with it is that this is a tax that more affects people with lower incomes than it does people with higher incomes. Likewise, I think that having some component of this is a tax cut that benefits not like the uber wealthy as media would make you think, but this is a tax cut that helps normal people, right? Like middle to lower income people. And it could be as simple as just reducing rates in those brackets. So long as you have the element in there of that this is a tax cut for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, fortunately, let's see, John. Hey, John. So you said in Iowa, only the Dems are calling for expanding the earned income tax credit. Okay. Yeah. I mean, fortunately, we don't have an income tax in Texas, so we don't have to worry about that. And hopefully Mississippi would be one would be number 10. I think they'll be the 10th state without an income tax.
Exactly.
So hopefully that will happen. But I know, for us, right, I think in general, tax relief really means lowering tax rates, lowering the burden of taxes overall. So that way everyone can benefit from that instead of earned income tax credit is really a spending type of program versus, at the federal level, the way we looked at OMB was a spending approach, not a tax approach. And so from that side of things, I would really try to steer them more towards actual tax relief, like lowering tax rates. Now, if that's not doable, and I think I agree with the other part of the conversation here, just given the political dynamics and everything, then maybe that is a better route to go than spending it on X, Y, and Z that they'll spend it across the budget. But I think if you're thinking about priorities, again, I wouldn't call it number one. What have you thought about it, Jonathan?
Well, yeah, that's I've had a lot of thoughts about it.
Okay.
And, Utah, for instance, just this last week is wrapping up its tax bills, and they will be lowering marginal rates again in Utah. Of course, the state of Utah is ranked number one in rich states, poor states for all 14 editions of our report, and they're always eager to stay at the top. But one of the parts of the package this year, I believe, was for the first time, at least in a while, instituting a state level EITC program in order to get to the issue of, well, what are you doing for the middle class, or what are you doing for the poor as part of the package, as Ganon was saying. But one of the differences about Utah than many of these programs is Utah did not make it refundable. So that obviously gets to a lot of the issues of improper payments and kind of creating an ATM through the tax code, as many times these play out. And so, Vance, I think, it's certainly a way to cut taxes, I suppose. And if you look at it that way, I can certainly see your argument about being a spending side program. But I think it's when you look at the overall various approaches of ways to cut taxes, what's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of economic growth and what helps lift the tide for all boats going forward? And I think that's probably clearly based on the evidence for pro-growth tax cuts of marginal rate reductions. And so I think it's one of those things that can be a useful tool as part of a broader mix. But would you go there first in terms of the most pro-growth method? I think the evidence is probably not there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm wondering, we've got a few more minutes here left together. And thanks again for everybody joining us today. What are some other good pro-growth efforts that states should be doing right now? And may I start with you, Matt? When you're thinking about the federal level, I mean, the states, what's really about just withstanding all of the nonsense, if you will, the bad policies that are coming out of Washington. I mean, we've got 7.5% unemployment rate, 6% if you look at the PCE. So, I mean, we've got 40-year highs in inflation, $30 trillion national debt. Just so much stuff is coming down. How do we make sure that the states can be in a situation where we can be as prosperous as possible and withstand that? Because we've still got a while. Even we got to wait till after the elections to see what happens in 2023. So there's going to be some time to withstand that. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to kill these bills, whether it be the Build Back Bankrupt or the Competes Act, which is really an anti-competitive act. But when you're thinking about those things, what might you suggest?
That's a great point. A couple of weeks ago, the Heritage Foundation put out a report addressing one of the biggest issues that people around the country are thinking about, and that's inflation and higher prices. And what's driving inflation? Well, it's bad policies at all levels of government that pump more money out in the economy, causing more goods to be chasing fewer goods and services. So there's a lot that policymakers can do at the federal as well as at the state level to address that problem of barriers to creating more goods and services. Specifically, labor is a big input into basically everything that anybody ever wants to buy, right? And a lot of states have a lot of really bad labor policies, things like occupational licensing, make it a lot harder for people to engage in different industries and move around. There's lots of other things that you could do to allow people to engage in more flexible work. Look at what California is doing with AB5 and the problems that's causing with truckers trying to go to the ports to try to get supplies through the country. So there's a lot of really important things that policymakers should be going to look at. So I would certainly check out the report from the Heritage Foundation called Inflation, Policymakers Should Stop Driving It and Start Fighting It.
Excellent. All right, what about the others? Any other thoughts?
Well, Vance, one kind of final group of thoughts on some of the most pressing issues, whether it's inflation or whether it's kind of dynamic of the new mobile workforce and workers kind of fanning out across the country from employers now with the flexibility that they have. And I think there's some smart ways for legislators to address some of these things. In fact, we just launched this last week our 2022 essential policy ideas across ALEC task forces. And so a lot of these are included up on the ALEC website now. But one of the things is when it comes to inflation is price inflation. We've seen it all over the place when it comes to housing values and property taxes. I know something you and I talk about a lot, Vance. One of the things that we have been developing is good model policy. And of course, Kansas, our friends at Kansas Policy Institute, passed, I think, the gold standard of truth in taxation, the ALEC model, based on Utah going back to the 1980s. South Dakota is even considering it this week, passed in Nebraska last year as well. Overwhelmingly, it was signed into law by Democrat Governor Laura Kelly. So it's a bipartisan solution, but it also gets the discussion around property tax burdens, which are locally driven because of local spending decisions in the vast majority of cases, back to the local level and really brings honesty and accountability to the debate, where it really forces local officials to say, if you want to spend more than you did last year, have an honest discussion with taxpayers and hold a public vote around the discussion. Don't blame the state level. Don't ask for more state dollars to come and backfill local spending mistakes and tax mistakes. Let's have a real honest discussion and address what is one of the biggest drivers, I think, of price inflation across the country, and that is assessment-driven property tax increases across the country.
That's a good point. James,
you ready? Yeah, just had one thing. When we were discussing about how to take all of this one-time revenues and use this to protect taxpayers well into the future, the thing that came up time and time again is pension funds. Like, you can pay off a lot of pension debt, but I don't recommend doing that until you get under the hood of these pension systems and you stop yourself from promising benefits now and paying and kicking the cost to future taxpayers. Changing assumptions, changing benefits so that when you promise to pay $1 of retirement benefits, you pay that $1 of retirement benefits and it doesn't become a burden on future people. So it's going to be a huge issue going forward. We had huge market gains over the past year, and we still have huge pension problems. Let's get in front of this. Let's do something about it. And Michigan's been a leader on this front.
Good point. Ganon?
Yes, I have something to say for all the 3 previous comments, so that's cool. I'll start with James's notion of, it's really important that a lot of this ARPA money that we're saying, well, it's just sitting there, it's hard to use. ARPA can be used to replenish state funds that were depleted because of COVID, and namely unemployment insurance. I know in the state of Kansas, for instance, we're $200 million down from the level at which it's full for the unemployment insurance. And so $200 million of ARPA would go through there. It would prevent debt from accumulating in the future. It would prevent money from the general fund from going there. It would make it more stable in the future, in case there's another.
And getting tax hikes on businesses.
True.
So
exactly. But R&R, revenue neutral rates, the Truth in Taxation bill has had huge success in Kansas. Between 1/2 and 2/3 of all bodies across the state are not increasing their property taxes, which is incredible. And then another 15-20% of those are increasing taxes by a minuscule amount. And all the bill does is that it just forces governments to be honest and be transparent about their spending, about their taxing and spending, which is at the core what good government should be doing. But going off just other good ideas for the states, I actually put out a state report for Kansas last week on streamlining regulations in the state. There's a lot of great ideas out there between occupational licensing reform, zoning reform to promote more affordable housing, regulatory sandboxes is a big idea right now, and then just methods by which local governments can sit down, look at their regulatory book, and evaluate and say, is this really needed? Is this a fair burden? What do we do with this regulation? Because at the end of the day, reducing the cost of living and the cost of business is an unspoken central goal of government, whether this be reducing taxation, and you can reduce taxation by reducing spending, having more efficient government operations, keeping the cost of housing down by addressing things like zoning, making it so that you still have room for middle income houses to be built and bought by people, and then keeping regulations down to create less of a cost for businesses to start up and to make it a more opportune state for economic development.
Thank you all so much. This has been excellent. Thank you for all these key insights that I know state lawmakers and those in Congress as well can take forward. I mean, really what we need to do is find ways to reduce the size and scope of government in our lives and in businesses across the economy, and then that will allow to unleash economic growth and prosperity. You know, one of the other things that I've been working on lately is called the Alliance for Opportunity, which is really a way to reduce government dependency, or people being dependent on government, and to provide more pathways to work and jobs and opportunities, so that way they can be more prosperous. That's at Alliance for allianceforopportunity.com. But it goes into all of this together, you know, about making sure that government stays within its its lanes, that we have a strong system of federalism, and fiscal rules are a great path for that, to prioritize where the dollar should go. And always, 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 we should have the taxpayer being the top priority. Too often they're overlooked, and this is a great way to really get that message going. So I appreciate the guests here today. Thanks for everybody else for joining, and I will talk to you soon. Until next time.